Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Welcome. I am Stephanie Jones and delighted to welcome you to the first lecture of an exciting series of lectures to be given by Professor Betty St.Pierre. As we gather here in person in Athens, Georgia, in the United States, and we welcome guests on Zoom from many countries around the globe, I want to begin by acknowledging the power and importance of place and labor and land. The University of Georgia is located on the traditional ancestral territory of Muskogee-speaking and Cherokee peoples, as well as other Native communities who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The lands occupied by the University of Georgia throughout the state were places of lived relationships, learning, ceremony, and resistance. We recognize these Native peoples as the original caretakers of this land, who continue to pass on their histories and traditions, sustaining connections to their ancestral lands and waters. We are able to gather here today due in part to the labor of enslaved people of African descent who helped to build this university, and the ongoing daily labor of many people whom students and faculty often rarely even see. I would like to acknowledge the people who have been directly involved with this series, including Jeff Reeder, who is our audiovisual expert. Thank you, Jeff. And Michael Weidenbaker, who is not with us today. Our graduate students, if you're here, just put a hand up so we can acknowledge you. Flora Adams, Sunja Chang, Lee Elliott, Melissa Kurtz, Lindsay Lush, Amos Manlanget, Maria Nazir, Vanessa Silvera, and Reed Stevenson. Thank you all. And my dear, thank you, yeah. And my dear UGA colleagues, Melissa Freeman, who is the program coordinator for the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Studies program, and Hillary Hughes. And I have worked alongside colleagues from other institutions, including Sophia Jong at Ohio State University, excuse me, Corey Johnson from North Carolina State University, Marty Schmeichel from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Karen Spector from the University of Alabama, and Jessica Van Cleve from Gardner-Webb University, and they really helped us to make this a reality. So thank you. Another round of thanks. The series is supported by the University of Georgia Institute for Women's Studies, the Graduate School Mary Frances Early College of Education, the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Studies Program, the Reg Playwriting Project, as well as the University of Alabama, North Carolina State, and the Ohio State University. And I want to thank each of you who are joining us today in person and via Zoom. Thank you all for making this what it can only be what it is right now because all of you have come here. So now a brief lesson on legacy. The University of Georgia, and specifically the College of Education, has been a leader in qualitative research for nearly 50 years and going strong. Back in 1976, a young early career professor named Jude Priestley was hired as an assistant professor for a social studies education position here. But it was clear from the beginning that the college was more interested in her background in anthropology and ethnographic practices. And they asked her to design a qualitative research class for students. The first qualitative course was offered that same year. And just like today, graduate students from many disciplines such as the arts and sciences, business, accounting, anthropology, and sociology started showing up for Jude's course. That early course focused on establishing rationale for conducting qualitative research, but Jude was always very adamant that if people had not read theory and philosophy, they wouldn't know what to do with those practices. Early career faculty at UGA were also curious about qualitative research at the time. So faculty and students were learning together in the late 1970s and 1980s. Dr. Jo Beth Allen was one of those early career professors who had no experience with qualitative research when she arrived on campus. But she committed herself to learning with and from Jude. They, along with others, established, with others, not only in the College of Ed, but across the entire university campus, established the Qualitative Inquiry Group, and later organized the first QUIG conference in 1988. The annual QUIG conference created national visibility for the leading edge interdisciplinary qualitative work happening here at UGA that had a tremendous impact on the kind of recruiting and retention that the College of Education and the university could do for faculty across disciplines. And as more qualitative faculty began to join the faculty at UGA, then more students came from across the country and globe to study with them. Put simply, the University of Georgia was emerging as a very unique academic space where innovative inquiry, was being taught, practiced, and published, and supported by a very large number of faculty and administrators. In 1994, Elizabeth Adams St.Pierre was a doctoral student at The Ohio State University. And she, like many inquisitive young doctoral students, made the trip to Athens, Georgia for the annual QUIG conference. The theme for the conference was Issues in Studying Gender, with keynotes by Patricia Bell-Scott, Michael Kimmel, and Kathleen Weiler. Betty's presentation that year was titled Gender in Student Teachers, Experiences in English Classrooms. In 1995, she joined the faculty at the University of Georgia. And I guess in a strange bit of connection, I also began my doctoral journey in the state of Ohio. I was at the University of Cincinnati, and in the year 2000, my advisor, the brilliant Deborah Hicks, suggested that I read a book edited by Betty St.Pierre and Wanda Pillow called Working the Ruins, Feminist Post-Structural Theory and Methods in Education. And in 2004, I made my own road trip from Ohio to Athens, Georgia, with my graduate school friends to see Betty St.Pierre, Kathleen Desmarais, Jo Beth Allen, Yolanda Majors, Betsy Rhymes, Juanita Johnson-Bailey, and other UGA faculty in person. They were giants to me. The invited keynote speakers that year were icing on top of the cake: Chris Gutierrez, Eleanor Oakes, and Carol D. Lee. My 2004 presentation that year at QUIG was called Poor White Girl, Talking Identities in the Classroom. The University of Georgia was the epicenter of exciting interdisciplinary qualitative research, and I knew that if I ever had the opportunity to join the faculty here, that I probably would. The late and beloved sociologist Norman Denson, who established the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry in 2005, gave keynotes at the QUIG conference in 2006 and in 2007. And for me, after spending 3 years at another institution, I had the opportunity to join UGA in 2007. The 20th and final QUIG conference was held in 2008, and many faculty and students started making the trek to Norm Denson's ICQI in Illinois. By the way, 2024 was the 20th ICQI conference. Since 2008, despite the tightening grip of neoliberalism on universities, and faculty, and efforts to reestablish experimental and quasi-experimental science as the gold standard in education, and the closing down of foundations of education programs and departments, and the dismantling of interdisciplinary programs and initiatives. Students and faculty here at UGA have continued to do brilliant, innovative, creative, critical, post-structural, feminist, post-humanist, arts-based, phenomenological, hermeneutical work here in brilliant ways. In fact, I have seen the most brilliant work by doctoral students in the last 10 years. Our interdisciplinary well of brilliance here is deep and wide, so much so that graduate students leave here and they experience intense disorientation. They spend their graduate years here, immersed in a pool of theory, philosophy, and methodology courses, and opportunities so rich and varied that they didn't know that it was possible for universities to exist without this robust presence of qualitative and post-qualitative inquiry. They often think, for example, that every institution has their own Betty St.Pierre. And they often realize when they are gone that they have been one of the fortunate ones to spend time with a giant among giants in a place with the kind of history and global impact that is easy to forget on a day-to-day basis. For the last 30 years, 3 decades, Betty St.Pierre has been a key figure in the always evolving and exciting landscape of qualitative and post-qualitative inquiry here at UGA. Her influence is beyond comprehension. Faculty, students, and folks in nonprofit organizations and other institutions from every corner of the globe registered to attend these lectures and workshops via Zoom webinar and in person. You, let me see, I'll look at the camera. You are in Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Brazil, China, Canada, Sweden, Norway, the UK. You are stretched across the United States. And of course, you are in this room too. Many of you were so excited about this rare opportunity to see and hear Dr. Betty St.Pierre speak that you even told me you would be showing up on Zoom in your jammies in the middle of the night, perhaps from bed. It is a distinct honor and personal pleasure to introduce you to a giant among giants, and my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Elizabeth St.Pierre.
Good afternoon. First, I want to thank Dr. Stephanie Jones, the faculty committee, and the group of students who've spent many hours making this lecture series possible. I'm very lucky they're my colleagues in this enterprise we call academia. I'm very happy to be with all of you today, and especially pleased to have my wonderful colleague, Dr. Aaron Kuntz, professor and dean at Florida International University, here to help us think. It's always exciting when you finally meet a scholar you've admired for a long time, and especially wonderful when you find yourself nodding along in agreement as you talk and finishing each other's sentences. If you haven't already, I encourage you to read his 2 award-winning books, The Responsible Methodologist and Qualitative Inquiry, Cartography, and the Promise of Material Change. We read these books in my classes and my students love them. Aaron is not just one of our top-notch thinkers, but also a lovely, graceful writer. Thank you, Aaron. When Stephanie first approached me about this lecture series last summer, I was taken aback. I've been writing, teaching, and presenting papers about Post Qualitative Inquiry, or PQI, as I've learned it's called, for about 15 years. So most everything I had to say was already out there. Why this now? As we continued to talk, Stephanie and I kept returning to our longing for what seems missing in our academic lives, what my good colleague Kathy Ralston calls the life of the mind. That's why we came to academia, to read, to think hard, to learn alongside our accomplished colleagues and students, to be scholars. We began to think of this lecture series as a possible space for those conversations. We thought some of the papers I've written about post-qualitative inquiry might serve as provocations for conversations about the history and politics of big concepts like epistemology and empiricism, ontology and immanence, mind and matter, and how they've been described and put to work differently in different systems of thought, and how they've constructed us along the way. That's what I look forward to this year as we talk with each other and our guests, the excitement of learning from each other. So I'm happy, I think, for some of my work to be the object of our gaze until our conversations take us somewhere else. I do caution that I might not agree today with something I wrote years ago, and I claim the right, as always, to change my mind. I want to focus now on my paper, A Primer for Post Qualitative Inquiry, which is the most recent paper I've written about post-qual. By my count, I've written about 15 journal articles and book chapters that focus directly on post-qualitative inquiry, and quite a few others that are related. So when Doctors Javier Monforte and Brett Smith invited me to write yet another paper on post-qual for a special issue of the journal Qualitative Research in Psychology, which they were editing, on the critical post-humanities and post-qualitative inquiry in psychology, I was hesitant to accept their invitation. I just written a chapter on post-qual for the Routledge International Handbook of Postmodern Therapies. I wasn't sure I had anything new to say, but I did find it intriguing that psychology and therapy might be interested in postmodernism and post-qualitative inquiry. Given that the posts refuse the human that has traditionally grounded those disciplines. So I wrote the primer as a sort of introduction for scholars who may not have studied either the posts or post-qual, and I organized the paper by questions I'm often asked, such as, where did post-qualitative inquiry come from? What is it, and how do you do it? In the primer paper, I wrote quite a bit more about the first question, where did it come from, than the other two, what is it and how do you do it? Because those are questions you wouldn't ask if you'd studied post-structuralism. I state clearly, as I always have, that post-qualitative inquiry begins with the work of scholars we now call postmodern or post-structural, though they typically refuse those labels. The terms postmodernism and post-structuralism are sometimes used interchangeably. In my thinking, postmodernism refers to the avant-garde in culture and the arts, and post-structuralism refers to academic theorizing after the posts. For example, I might refer to postmodern art or film, but say my scholarship is post-structural. But I also use the terms interchangeably given my project and my audience. How did I find post-structuralism? I began my doctoral studies at The Ohio State University in 1991 when I was 45. I had already had 2 successful careers as an English teacher and a librarian, and I came back to the university at midlife because I trusted I would find something there that would change my life. I had no research interests and no agenda, but I was ready to work hard. I was lucky to find 2 brilliant feminist professors who were trying to make the postmodern turn, Patty Lather in education and Laurel Richardson in sociology. At that time, they were reading and writing about, but not really teaching, Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, Deleuze, Lyotard, as well as feminists like Judith Butler, Susan Heckman, Jane Flax, Linda Nicholson, and others who were writing about postmodernism and post-structuralism. Patty and Laurel had organized a reading group of feminists from different disciplines at Ohio State called PMS, Postmodern Studies. They were trying to think feminism with the posts. I read their papers and books and listened hard in their classes because I wanted to know what they were reading and thinking. With their guidance, I studied feminist theory, feminist epistemology, and feminist methodology, paying attention to feminists who were in general cautious about the methodologies and methods of the sciences and social sciences, finding them sexist and racist and colonialist. Sandra Harding asked that big question, who does science and knowledge belong to? Judith Stacy asked whether there could even be a feminist ethnography. And Joan Scott warned us to be careful about grounding knowledge in lived experience. I should also point out that across all that work was a strong refusal of logical positivism, which I had to study seriously some years later when positivists took over educational research and determined that the gold standard for scientific research in education is the randomized controlled trial. It was those feminists who took me to the French boys, as one of my friends called them. As Patty Lather left class one night, she said, "You can't read too much Foucault." In my notes, I wrote F-U-K-O-W. I had no clue what Foucault was. But I found him and others through feminism. Judith Butler and Patty Lather took me to Foucault. Gayatri Spivak took me to Derrida. Rosie Braidotti took me to Deleuze. I want to be clear, there were no doctoral courses on post-structuralism or post-structural feminism, and that I read and studied that scholarship on my own and occasionally in student reading groups. I couldn't read fast enough. Even though those texts were too hard to read, I knew I needed them, not just for doctoral studies, but to live for the rest of my life. I read and read and read, knowing that the next book or article might well challenge everything I thought was real and true. That reading was and still is risky, thrilling work, what I believe is the ground of scholarship. And in that reading, I finally began to understand Richard Rorty's startling statement that we only know the world and ourselves under a description that may be dominant, but is neither necessary nor real. I understood that I had been theorized, made, disciplined in a particular way by a description I had not chosen, and I wasn't happy about that. But I also understood the implications of Rorty's comment. If the world and I have been made, invented in description, written into existence, then they can be redescribed, rewritten. That sounded like freedom to me. And that's what I was looking for when I began my doctoral studies. The refusal of the given, the taken for granted, the way it is, and a commitment to reinvention. Judith Butler called that work subversive repetition, the refusal to repeat. Foucault wrote that we must refuse what we are, how we've been made, produced, and disciplined in dominant discourses and practices. Derrida wrote about opening up structures so that something different can happen. Deleuze wrote about the creation of the new, what we can't yet think or do. In other words, post-structural scholarship has very practical consequences. On the one hand, I found the promise of post-structuralism very attractive. On the other hand, I listened to Butler's and Nietzsche's warnings that we should think carefully about the appeal of a particular system of thought. Butler wrote the following: "For the question of whether or not a position is right, coherent, or interesting is less informative than why it is we come to occupy and defend the territory we do, what it promises us from what it promises to protect us." Nietzsche wrote much the same. One seeks a picture of the world in that philosophy in which we feel freest, in which our most powerful drive feels free to function. I take those warnings to heart. At the same time, I take seriously Spivak's warning that what I cannot imagine stands guard over everything. I want the freedom to imagine and think differently, to live differently. And I continue to find that freedom, that challenge in the work of scholars we call post-structural. So what is post-structuralism? The problem with any what is question, Plato's question, is that it's essentialist and assumes there is an essence of something which is stable, which is, so it can be recognized and closed off into a concept like post-structuralism. But the post refused essentialism because post-structuralism works with an ontology of immanence in which the world is never stable and passive. It never is. Rather, it is always coming into being. It is in continual variation, never the same, always different. How do we describe something then if we can't explain what it is? A philosophical rule of thumb is to start with negative definitions, which are always easier to understand. For example, early in his book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault explained the kinds of history he was not doing, clearing some space for his own kind of history, archaeology. Derrida, in his letter to a Japanese friend, did the same and wrote that deconstruction is neither an analysis nor critique. It is not a method, especially in the instrumental sense of method. He wrote that it's not an act or an operation, nor is it something that can be applied to a text. He did write that deconstruction is justice, but that may not satisfy some of us. So there's no one thing called post-structuralism. It refuses definition. Scholars we've assigned to the category post-structuralism worked out of the traditions of different disciplines and had different projects. They didn't necessarily agree with each other, and they changed their minds over the course of their careers. But I think Jane Flax is helpful here. She wrote that postmodern discourses are all deconstructive in that they seek to distance us from and make us skeptical about beliefs concerning truth, knowledge, power, the self, and language that are often taken for granted within and serve as legitimation for contemporary Western culture, which I would argue is humanist. What kind of work did those French continental scholars do and why? In 1993, Gayatri Spivak, who translated and wrote the preface to Derrida's Of Grammatology, his classic book on deconstruction, offered the following reasons for and summary of their critique of humanism. Here's Spivak. The critique of humanism in France was related to the perceived failure of the European ethical subject after World War II. The second wave of critique in the mid-60s, coming in the wake of the Algerian Revolution, sharpened that critique in terms of disciplinary practice in the humanities and social sciences, because as historians, philosophers, sociologists, and psychologists, the participants felt that their practice was not merely a disinterested pursuit of knowledge, as some claimed, but productive in the making of human beings. It was because of this that they did not accept unexamined human experience as a source of meaning and the making of meaning as an unproblematic thing. Spivak then lists some of those scholars and their approaches as follows: Foucault's archaeology, genealogy, and power knowledge reading, Deleuze's schizoanalysis and rhizoanalysis, Lacan's non-subjective psychoanalysis, hear that, non-subjective, Derrida's affirmative deconstruction, and Lyotard's paralogic legitimation. Of course, it would be impossible in a single lifetime of scholarship to understand all those approaches. But if you want to think and live with those ideas, begin with Spivak's handy list and dig in. Read Foucault's archaeologies and genealogies. Read Lyotard's book about postmodernism and paralogy. Read Deleuze's sole-authored book. And then his later work with Guattari, in which they invent a blast of original concepts to reorient thought. And if you're attached to feminism, think how your feminism might or might not work with the posts. Of course, those 20th century French philosophers didn't come from nowhere. They're part of a long line of philosophers that includes Lucretius, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Whitehead, and others who were their precursors, and whose work is often opposed to the traditional line of philosophy that includes Plato, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and others. So those French boys will always take you to Nietzsche and Bergson and Whitehead and others. This has been the pleasure of scholarship for me, finding thinkers who have always refused the dogmatic image of thought, finding allies. When I started reading this literature, I began to ask why I had not studied it earlier. I did read Nietzsche at 19 as an undergraduate. Perhaps that's why post-structuralism was not alien when I found it. More seriously, I questioned why I wasn't studying it in my doctoral courses, where we typically began with some small topic that seemed to come from nowhere, as if its very existence wasn't enabled by a larger system of thought like interpretive theory or Marxist theory. Altogether, I had been in school then for almost 20 years, and I felt cheated that I had lived half my life without feminist, critical, and post-structural thought, at least. What would my life have been like if I'd read Judith Butler and Kimberly Crenshaw and Michel Foucault and Frantz Fanon sooner? What would my life have been like if I'd understood that I had been theorized, made, produced, and without my consent, that the way I am and the way the world is not natural or meant to be? Those are questions of power and politics, of course. And I had been mostly a docile student, a good girl, disciplining myself, producing myself in an invisible and dogmatic system of thought that grounded my education, even my doctoral studies, but no longer. So I found what would be the focus of my scholarship for many years and began to study different descriptions of human being in humanist and in post-structural scholarship, because it seemed absolutely necessary that I, this Betty, understand the implications of being called an individual, a self, a person with a personal identity, an I, a she, a woman. Two great Enlightenment British empiricists, John Locke and David Hume, both argue that each of us humans has a personal identity that stays the same throughout time. You can read their papers and watch them invent that human with a personal identity from one word to the next, from one sentence to the next. They wrote this person, Betty with a personal identity, into an existence because they needed it for their empirical project. In his historical work, Foucault reminded us that the human sciences had to invent the human they needed to invent themselves. Miraculously, humanism's cunning sleight of hand extracts human being from the rest of being and puts it at the beginning and center of everything else that exists. This is man, the master of the universe. Dr. Kuntz has called the rationale for plucking one bit of being from everything else in which it is always already imbricated, the logic of extraction. But what a feat inventing that man. Of course, women and others cannot be masters of the universe, cannot be what Deleuze and Guattari call the strange persona of investigator advanced by the empiricists. No wonder I agreed with Foucault that we have to promote new forms of subjectivity through the refusal of this kind of individuality. No wonder I turned toward the different descriptions of human being I found in the work of post-structural scholars. But remember that I studied that theory on my own, not in doctoral courses, which were mostly grounded in unacknowledged humanist theories, which assume an intentional human, a person born with agency who exists ahead of the world. In other words, the humanism that saturated most of my doctoral training, including my training in qualitative methodology, was neither identified nor questioned. In my doctoral studies, philosophy and theory, even humanist theories, seemed optional, but methodology was required. In education, we were expected to do empirical, not theoretical or philosophical research, and the choice then was between qualitative and quantitative empirical research. Mixed methods research hadn't yet been invented. As an English major and former English teacher, I was happy to choose qualitative methodology and work with language instead of numbers. Besides, qualitative research was still new, edgy, illegitimate. It was the other, and it still is in some disciplines that are paradigms behind. I understood the appeal of qualitative research right away, and I want to read a quote from a paper I wrote titled A Brief and Personal History of Post Qualitative Research, which I think helps explain why qualitative research has been such a successful knowledge production machine. If you listen, I think you can hear the humanism post-structuralism refuses. I wrote the following about the lure of qualitative research. Instead of reading statistical data collected in surveys and experiments in which people and what they thought and felt and did were disappeared in numbers and graphs, we qualitative researchers wanted people live, in person, present. We wanted to talk with them face to face, to see firsthand what their faces and bodies looked like when they described their everyday lived experiences. We wanted to see their pain. We wanted to witness their oppression firsthand. We wanted to laugh and weep with them when they told us their stories. We wanted to hear their voices, which came from the depths, the core of their inner being. We wanted to watch them in their natural settings as they really were. We wanted to get to the ground of truth, to the reality of their everyday lives. We longed for our own experiences of being there with them in the field, being present, being witnesses in the moment with them. Then, if we carefully and systematically captured and recorded that authentic reality, we could reproduce it, represent it in words and thick description, so that others could read our texts and be there too. Even after the crisis of representation, we continued to present our participants to our readers on a silver platter for the sake of knowledge. I think that description captures to some extent the lure of qualitative fieldwork, the desire for the primordial lived, the brute reality of authentic experience, what really happens out there before it's obscured and contaminated by interpretation. That description also presents all sorts of problems for someone who studied post-structuralism, including its description of human being, of language, of reality, of representation, of knowledge, of science. Again, I chose qualitative instead of quantitative methodology, and my dissertation research was a humanist, feminist, qualitative study from top to bottom, a combination of an interview study with 36 older white Southern women who lived in my hometown and an ethnography of their small community. In other words, I set post-structural thought I had studied on my own to the side and rushed to humanist qualitative methodology, which I had been taught. I began with a prescribed humanist set of methods and practices that told me what to do. I had a recipe, a plan, and I set to work. If I had begun with post-structuralism, I would never have done that very humanist study with that very humanist methodology. But because I had studied post-structuralism and qualitative methodology separately, it didn't really register with me that they belonged to incommensurable systems of thought until I tried to write the methodology chapter of my dissertation. The dissertation I wrote was a typical 5-chapter research report with an introduction, a literature review, a discussion of methodology, a discussion of findings, and then a conclusion. Laurel Richardson had easily convinced me that writing is inquiry, and I did indeed write that dissertation to think and learn. I suppose that ended up being the problem. I'm a happy writer most of the time, and I moved steadily through the first 2 dissertation chapters, and especially enjoyed pulling together the literature on post-structuralism and post-structural feminism. So I was steeped in post-structuralism as I began to write the methodology chapter, which I didn't think would be too difficult because I knew what the section headings of that chapter should be. They're the chapter headings of many qualitative textbooks. Discussions of the research problem, research questions, site of the study, participants, data, methods of data collection, methods of data analysis, and so on. And I could and did write that chapter, except that it didn't really work. My study simply didn't fit into the categories of qualitative methodology because I had been reading, thinking, and living with the deconstruction of human being, language, reality, representation, knowledge, truth, and so on during field work, whatever that is. So in chapter 3, I did what was popular at the time. I worked within and against the structure of qualitative methodology. I described my study using conventional qualitative categories in a section called Methods Are Easy, and then I deconstructed all of that in a section called Folding is Hard, using Deleuze's ontological concept, the fold. That concept, the fold, and other post-structural concepts had reoriented my thinking without my realizing it. I could not think methodology and the fold together. In the primer paper for today's lecture, I include some quotations from the methodology chapter of my dissertation that provide evidence, if you will, of the failure of a pre-existing humanist research methodology in the face of the posts. One of those quotations points to post-qualitative inquiry, which I couldn't name at the time. I'll read that sentence now. I believe that the persistent critique urged by post-structuralism enables a transition from traditional methodology to something different, and I'm not too concerned at the time with naming whatever might be produced. I could say then that post-qualitative inquiry began for me in 1995 as I wrote the methodology chapter of my dissertation. It was nameless, imminent. I came to the University of Georgia after I graduated from Ohio State, and in 2004, I developed a doctoral course called Postmodern Qualitative Research to support students who were taking my courses in postmodern theory, Foucault, and Derrida. The readings in early syllabi for that course were deconstructions of various concepts and practices in qualitative methodology. The interview, voice, data, analysis, validity, method, authenticity, narrative, experience, and so on. By the time we read all those papers, there was nothing much left of humanist qualitative methodology. It was ruined. But the title of that course, Postmodern Qualitative Research, indicates that 8 years after the post deconstructed methodology in my dissertation, I still thought I could apply postmodernism to qualitative methodology. I still thought I could make it postmodern. It was very difficult for me to escape my training as a methodologist, to just leave methodology behind and try to do something different from the beginning. In 2010, Norman Denzin asked me to write the validity chapter for the 2011 Sage Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry. I told Norman that I didn't believe in validity, but that I could write a chapter on post-qualitative inquiry. Actually, I ended up writing about 125 pages trying to figure it out, and then had to reduce all that to a handbook chapter. But I believe writing that chapter ruined any vestiges of methodology I'd been clinging to and opened up a space for me to think. Now, I want to emphasize that deconstruction is not the rejection of a structure, and post-qualitative inquiry is not the rejection of what I call conventional humanist qualitative methodology. It's something entirely different, and it is not another pre-existing humanist social science research methodology to be added to that familiar list: quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, case-based, measurement, psychometric, assessment, evaluation, and so on. Post-qual always begins with post-structural systems of thought, image of thought, and their concepts. Though deconstruction does not reject humanism structures, including its methodologies, it does call into question the fundamental concepts of Western ontology that enable them. As Derrida and Spivak explained, deconstructions loosens up those structures to make room for the emergence of a new concept, a concept which no longer allows itself to be understood in terms of the previous regime. Likewise, Deleuze, following Foucault, argued that the deconstruction or refusal of a major concept like humanism's human or its methodology is nothing more and nothing less than the unfolding of a space in which it is finally once again possible to think. Indeed, that emptiness invites us to set up a new image of thought that enables the unthought within thought. Now, I'm certainly not claiming that post-qualitative inquiry is a new concept or a new image of thought, but I have been clear that it is not thinkable in the humanist, realist system of thought that has produced those standalone, pre-existing humanist research methodologies I listed earlier. It begins with the immanent ontology and concepts of post-structuralism, and we will focus on immanence in some of those concepts in other lectures. Above all, I have argued that post-qual must remain in continual variation, never the same, immanent. It never is. With the help of Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and others, I think of post-qualitative inquiry as the unfolding of a space in which it is possible to think, to invent, to create. As I've written, I work hard to keep that space smooth, not stride it with instructions, though others like to describe and define it. Some even call it a methodology. When that happens, I know they haven't studied post-structuralism. If you recall in the section of the primer on how to do post-qualitative inquiry, I list quotations from Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and others that explain why they refuse pre-existing method. And I'll return to those quotations in these lectures. But you only find those explanations if you're reading post-structuralism. My point is that reading post-structuralism is absolutely essential in this work. I tell my students that no one can read for you and that people who read a lot can always tell when others don't. In these lectures, then, I will return to the work of those post-structural scholars who address some of the big ideas I've mentioned today, like epistemology and empiricism, ontology and immanence, and to their philosophical concepts like the fold, which are not meant to be applied, but to reorient thinking. And then, of course, I'm always interested in doctoral training, the lure of methodology, the obsession with knowing in advance where to begin and what to do, and always with logical positivism, that dense and powerful humanist theory that claims to be theory-free and dominates the human social sciences. Today, I've mostly talked about how I found post-structuralism as a doctoral student, how it's influenced not just my scholarship, but also my life, and how it helped me think post-qualitative inquiry. But post-qualitative inquiry isn't the only new approach out there. A few years ago, Dr. Kuntz invited me to help edit a special issue of a journal on new approaches to inquiry. In that special issue, Dr. Kuntz wrote about Horatia, Maggie McClure wrote about divination, Alicia Jackson wrote about thought without method, and Lisa Matzey wrote about minor inquiry. And no doubt papers describing other new approaches are being written and published right now. The good news is that we have Dr. Kuntz with us here today, and that Maggie McClure, Alicia Jackson, Lisa Matzey, as well as Martine Camaret, Jonathan Eckel, Sophia Zhang, and her colleague Sarah Lynn McKinnon-Baker are all coming to UGA this year to inspire and work with us. Dr. Zhang and Dr. McKinnon-Baker will be with us on October 7 as we focus on empiricism, that centuries-old epistemological project that dominates our work in the social sciences. In closing, I'd like to say, I know full well that we are products of our training, our attachments, and our historical time. I know we can only be where we are, but I have confidence that together with our guests, we can help each other begin to empty out the habitual, the normal, the taken for granted, what goes without saying, so we can unfold spaces in which we might be able to think the unthought within thought and live differently. Thanks so much for your kind attention this afternoon. I hope to see you again in October. And in the meantime, I wish you good fortune in your work and lives. Thank you very much.